Hello and welcome to TL Blue, your fortnightly cybersecurity podcast focused on important cybersecurity news for Australian organisations. My name is Brad Morgan. I'm the head of managed services at Triskel Labs. And today I'm joined by a couple of special guests in Craig Martin, Triskel Labs head of incident response, and Caleb Boyd, one of our senior DFIR analysts. I just want to address off the bat, I've been away for a couple of months, so I do want to thank everyone who has taken the time to fill in and make sure this podcast keeps coming out at a fairly regular occurrence. So with that said, let's dive into what we're covering off today. Caleb and Craig, welcome to both of you.
No worries.
Good to be
Thanks,
here.
Brad. Good to have you back.
It's good to be back. Well, I'm still finding my feet, so I'm going to rely on you two today a little bit. But it's been an interesting time to come back to work. We've had some super funds suffering some credential stuffing attacks. We've had the sudden news about CVE having some funding issues, or MITRE having some funding issues regarding the CVE database. RansomHub have had some issues. And Forti and Ivanti have been posting some vulnerabilities as per usual. So with that said, I'm really keen to jump into something that affects nearly every working age Australian, superannuation funds. Let's discuss what's been happening there. I mean, if you haven't heard about this, I think you've been living under a rock, but I'm more than happy to get your thoughts on this one, guys.
Yeah, so look, it feels like every 12 months there's another credential stuffing attack, and credential stuffing enters the headlines again. And this time, probably more impactful than what we've seen historically. So a number of Australia's biggest super funds were targeted by this credential stuffing attack, where it's just a threat actor seeking to use previously compromised passwords and hoping somebody's reusing those passwords across their different accounts. Once they've actually compromised those accounts, they've got this sort of extra barrier which is completely out of their control, which is unusual, where in order to actually make any money from the compromise, the victim needs to be a certain age and their pension needs to be in the appropriate setting to allow for money to get taken out. So it's sort of a bit of a two-step process, but we did see that a number of super funds actually shared that accounts had been compromised. So one super fund said approximately 600 members were compromised. Another was sharing sort of numbers in the range of 20,000 accounts were compromised. Now, you know, whether that means they were targeted for access or they were accessed, you know, there's sort of different beliefs there. But you know, the result of one of the attacks saw $500,000 being transferred out of super fund accounts into, you know, bank accounts under the control of the threat actor, which is quite significant for quite a low level attack using some pretty simplistic techniques.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. It is. I mean, I tried to log in to with a large Australian super fund. I tried to log into my account late that day when the news broke, and it just kept saying your account does not exist on the website. And I was worried. And I understand how difficult it is to roll funds out of my super fund because I'm not of age. But it still had me concerned, to the point where I discussed with my father-in-law on the weekend. He is of retirement age. It impacts there that if someone had been able to compromise his account, and it put the fear of God into him, thankfully. And he's putting some controls in place. So I'd love to, I guess, get your points on what we think the industry needs to do to help try and secure these accounts, but also what end users need to do, because let's be honest, until these providers take action, there are certain things that the users can do as well.
Yeah. So funnily enough, I was sitting in Dubai at the time, in the airport lounge, and I'm trying to see if my account had been compromised and couldn't quite figure it out because I wasn't allowed in. I was trying to get into my account so that I could apply multi-factor authentication to it.
I tried. I can't do it.
Yeah, so exactly right. So my super fund didn't have multi-factor authentication. which
Mine still doesn't.
is definitely a takeaway. We're going to be seeing that turned on, no doubt, in the very short term for some of these funds. But the other key learning that you can take away from it is if you've got a password that's unique and you only use for that site, you can never be victim to a credential stuffing attack.
Yep, exactly. And I mean, Caleb, I'll get your thoughts in a sec, but where my mind goes with this, and it touches on something that Craig, you said a little while ago, if you're of a certain age where you can actually access these funds and you have been caught up in a number of other significant breaches, I'm thinking Medibank and I'm thinking a number of other Australian breaches, and these threat actors are able to start putting some of your profile together and only targeting those accounts where they know that you are of a certain age, it lowers the barrier of entry for them, right? At least my super fund, they use a member number, but I know of some other people out there who their funds use email addresses or they use first dot last name. And, we're at that point where there's been so many breaches, we have to think about how threat actors are profiling and using that data that they've gathered from multiple breaches to now start attacking individuals.
Yeah, they're getting that data from somewhere, right? Those old passwords, well, with this stuffing attack, those passwords are coming from somewhere and they're from old breaches. So they don't just come out of nowhere and just randomly generate passwords. They come in from your actual accounts that have been breached in previous incidents, and then they're hoping that you don't change those passwords. So Craig mentioned something which is fantastic, is making sure you're using a unique password for every account. That would immediately help out with that situation. Really good call is also the work that Troy Hunt has done at Have I Been Pwned. Obviously, maybe the sad part about this is it's targeting our vulnerable individuals who might not be as likely to use that service, but for us, it might be something that we can look into.
Definitely. And look, I mean, let's be honest, if the people hitting their 60s have worked with computers in the past, but if you're still dealing with someone in their 70s, 80s, 90s that don't realize the risk involved in having these authentications and having the same password across multiple accounts, they're the ones who are at high risk because you can transfer out of those accounts very, very easily. Which to the point where, I went to the point of setting up password vaults for my mum recently because it scares me. So.
Yeah. And do we have an obligation as, cybersecurity professionals or organizations as a whole at protecting those individuals that might not be as cyber aware, almost enforcing MFA at a user level and saying, hey, you fit this bill, you have to have MFA, or we will do some sort of other security control. There's other ways of going about it as well.
There is. I mean, I was asked recently if I think Australia will be the most secure country on the planet by 2035, and I laughed. 2030, sorry, and I laughed.
Yeah.
This shows why, right? If we can't even have MFA forced across our super funds, and our super fund is, when we look at our collective super, second largest retirement savings fund in the world for a nation, and we don't have MFA by default across all of them, we have zero chance.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's me having a little bit of a rant on my return.
Where do you reckon it comes from? Do you reckon it's just legacy systems and those systems are really hard to implement MFA?
I think it is, but when we see Insignia being done as well, not just the funds, but a back-end platform, I think that you're right. It is a legacy issue, but surely we are now at a point where these things can be resolved. When I've got, I go and log into Department of Transport here in Victoria, Vic Roads, and they're more secure than my super fund. I'm a little bit concerned. This is the one that's really concerning me, knowing the number of vulnerabilities that we're seeing released on an annual basis at the moment. So MITRE have come out and said that the Department of Homeland Security in the US has not renewed the contract with MITRE Corporation to operate the CVE, or the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures Program, leading to concerns around the program's continuity. I have thoughts on this, but I'm really keen to see what you guys are thinking on this one.
I'm scared from a deeper perspective. CVEs are so useful because from our point of view, we're trying to pinpoint how attackers moved, how it's happened. And when you're looking at a system and you can type in, Veeam vulnerability, it'll come up with all the CVEs that are related and which ones are actively exploited. I don't know what can replace it. So I'm really worried for us how we can pinpoint that in the future if it does go.
Yeah, I'm terrified. Craig, what's your take on this one?
Yeah, like the real crux of it is there is the ability to consume the CVEs that's really beneficial, but also where do you go if you find a CVE now? Like where do you go if you find a new vulnerability, or if your organization gets compromised by a vulnerability? How do you tell anyone? The barrier to inform the wider cybersecurity community basically just becomes insurmountable almost overnight. We know, based on the matters that we work on, threat actors like to specialize in on certain vulnerabilities, and they will develop their tool sets to exploit these vulnerabilities. So if you find a really sophisticated threat actor and they find or obtain access to a vulnerability that nobody knows about, they will use that against every single user of that platform until somehow, there is news coverage or that organization goes direct to the vendor then patches, but then nobody knows they need to apply a security patch. Like, it's just this massive vicious cycle. And in the last 12 months, as a response team, we're seeing vulnerabilities being exploited more. So the ratio of incidents that are stemming from exploited vulnerabilities is increasing. So now if you've got nobody managing those vulnerabilities, it's only going to get worse.
100%. I mean, the fact that the US government a number of years ago started compiling known exploited vulnerabilities onto the CISA KEV list just screams how important a centralized knowledge base of all of these vulnerabilities is. You're 100% correct. The big tech organization or the big software producers are never going to voluntarily go, hey, we've got this, if they're not called out. It's very rare that they're going to go and self-report. If we then lose that central location to do that, it's just going to fragment. I hope, and I might be a little bit optimistic here, but I hope that the leaders of these big tech companies can see that, and they will actually start tipping money into MITRE to go and keep the CEV system alive. I hope that that's what the US government is planning for, is that they're trying to shift the burden from them having to sponsor this program to the people writing the poor code, or the people who are actually benefiting from us having to go and fix vulnerabilities. So Qualys, Rapid7, Tenable, they tip money into it, or they might have to pay to access it. And then we can all benefit from that, from those sorts of things. Microsoft, Google, Adobe, Ivanti, Forti, all of these organizations with the highest number of vulnerabilities out there, maybe they need to be tipping in funds to keep this system moving, because otherwise they're going to have to develop in-house processes to try and start communicating amongst themselves. That's my take. Hopefully, something like that happens if DHS doesn't tip money back into it to keep it moving. What's your thoughts on that?
Couldn't agree more. I think the overall benefit to the industry, I'm sure that's not lost on some of these big tech companies. And while they do cause a lot of the CVEs, they are the source of a lot of those CVEs, they also would be the victim, a lot of them as well.
They are.
And it's not a massive amount of money in the scheme of the overall tech industry. So
exactly. So I just hope that we don't lose sight of how open the tech industry has been historically around this sort of thing. And it is built on open source communication, and it's based on a lot of collaboration between different very, very smart people historically, and this sort of thing just needs to have someone funding it to support it and keep it moving. Your bread and butter guys, Tech Hub, RansomHub, have had some issues recently. Fill me in on this one.
Well, I reckon it would have been maybe 2 months ago. We were branding RansomHub as the new Lockbit. They're the most prolific group in the world. They were bringing in affiliates left, right, and center. Everybody was operating under their banner. And then a couple of weeks ago, they just vanished. So their leak site was offline. There were negotiations that were live and active, and they just disappeared. And then there was starting to be some rumorings coming out of, industry folk around potentially some internal disputes and some issues around the internal operations of the business that's resulted in a fair bit of distress and potentially some fear of law enforcement as things are starting to crumble.
Yep.
And, come riding in on a white horse a couple of days later is this group named DragonForce that have now started up a new leak site for RansomHub powered by DragonForce. So there's now this, we're still waiting to see what it looks like in action. There hasn't been any new leaks published. There hasn't really been any activity on this new site, but it's been running for about 2 weeks, and probably anticipating pretty soon we're going to start to see some breaches being published by RansomHub, who are now a subsidiary almost, or managed by DragonForce.
That blows me away. It just shows that they're just like any other business, right? They have the growing pains. They have all the political stuff that comes with a growing organization. I find it fascinating.
Yeah.
Um,
And like they're a ransomware as a service model. So there's different affiliates with different skill sets, and they've all got different paydays they're expecting as well. So it's going to be interesting to see where all these affiliates land, and if they do decide to go under DragonForce or something else. I don't know what your thoughts are around that, Caleb, if there's sort of anything that we've seen.
Yeah, I guess from our perspective, we've seen the kind of back end of how they actually operate, and it's a very haphazard business model. You've seen individuals that are working under these names, but it doesn't necessarily mean that a bad guy, in this case an attacker, can't work under the RansomHub name and the Kira name and the Lockbit name. They can operate under multiple different names, but they're still the same attacker, and they will just get the benefits from different groups as they see fit. And we've seen this first case scenario. In a couple of instances, persistence is a really good way to attribute it to the actual individual performing the attack rather than the group. And we've seen persistence mechanisms tying back to IP addresses across different groups. Whether that's just them sharing infrastructure, I'd say highly unlikely. It's more than likely an individual that's working across multiple groups. But very interesting.
That's interesting. So I see that as almost a model where, say we're running a phishing campaign for a client and it fails in one service, and then we can go to another service to run a phishing campaign. So it's starting to really bring ransomware as a service into view, is what I'm hearing there.
Yeah, it's just a brand name at this point, I'm starting to think. And, Lockbit they were kind of the big guys at one point, and everyone knew about Lockbit and it was widely publicized, but Lockbit doesn't really exist at the moment. And now RansomHub, 2 months ago, we're saying, RansomHub is going to be the new Lockbit. And we might just see this whole cycle of filtering through brand names, but realistically, it's the same people doing the attack.
That's scary. That makes it much harder to attribute, I believe, from the SOC point of view. Anyway, I don't know how you guys hit in DeFi, but that makes my life a lot harder.
Yeah, and the negotiations are all different, right? There might be one person that's doing the negotiation and another person doing the attack. So you might go from one group to the next, and really hard to predict what to expect.
So it's like dealing with operations on one hand, and then sales and customer or account managers on the other. My
Exactly,
gosh. Yikes. That's huge. So what can we do? I mean, ransomware's everywhere, right? I know organizations are taking appropriate steps, but is there anything that you guys have seen lately that you think organizations really need to be doing?
Look, the obvious one still is just don't be the lowest hanging fruit. Just get the basics right. I think the more this plays out, the more this really highlights that ransomware isn't a virus. Ransomware is a business, and encryption is the output of the process that they follow to extort you. You know, trying to really express the sophistication of this business to people is probably the biggest challenge that we face.
Yeah, I mean, you've hit the nail on the head there. I mean, everyone asks us, what are your deliverables? What can you do for me? Now, if I'm a threat actor and I'm going to go and use a service to ransomware people, I want to know, okay, how are you going to get me in? Number one, that's your initial access brokers. Number two, how are you going to help me move around the environment, find the crown jewels, export the data? Number two, how are you going to help me actually get paid? And they have to make this so quick and easy for people that it's almost getting to a point where it's point here, click here, do this.
Yeah, absolutely. And as sanctions are increasing, the likelihood of organizations receiving these affiliates receiving a payment sort of becomes a risk. Because if a group gets sanctioned, all of a sudden they're not going to get paid no matter how bad it is. So that's the other thing, is these groups are now just spinning up and shutting down as fast as you can possibly imagine. And it just makes sanctioning anybody that we do actually identify pretty much useless.
Yeah. And look, and this is a question without notice. I apologize. I have a habit of going off topic. You guys will find this out. How easy is it to decrypt? If you do receive the decryption keys, these things are quick to encrypt. Are they really bad at decrypting?
It all varies by the group and by the encryption means. Sometimes some groups are great, and then you get the complete opposite side of the things where some of those files you cannot decrypt, and they might be your really important files and you can never get them back. There's a really good, we use a negotiating firm called Codeware, and when we do go down those avenues, they will give us a little bit of insight to what to expect, and then they will also pull apart the keys and they can make their own decryptor, which has a lot more success. But you're buying something from a threat actor, what can you really expect, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's sort of what I was trying to get to, right? Like what Craig said about is don't be the lowest hanging fruit. At the end of the day, even if you've got the money sitting there to pay a threat actor, don't think you're just going to be able to snap your fingers and be back online quickly, because the business interruption and the impact can carry on for a very, very long time from what I've seen. I think it's time to talk about FortiGate.
Sounds good. Yet again.
It feels like I haven't been on leave. We're still talking about FortiGate and Ivanti. So look, I'd love to get your input on this one, Caleb. Is what I'm seeing here is a number of vulnerabilities, and it comes back to what we've just been saying, don't be the lowest hanging fruit. We're seeing a CVE from, and again, how important CVEs are, right? A CVE from 2022, 2023, and 2024 on a release from CISA and ASD in 2025. Let's walk through this one in a little bit of detail.
Yeah, the technical side of this vulnerability is really interesting. Obviously, we joke about it, but FortiGate's very proactive in their, vulnerability disclosure. And in some instances, that makes them a really good product because they're quick to patch and they give you a lot of details.
They are, and I do apologize. I like hanging out there on these organizations, but I do appreciate the good ones as well.
Yes, definitely. But this one actually, they talk about symbolic links. And I know about symbolic links from, I guess, a digital forensics point of view, and it essentially means that it's a shortcut. And
Yep.
this vulnerability works by a threat actor creating a shortcut to the file system of the FortiGate device. And why that's worrying is because if a threat actor was able to exploit that, and then they can use that shortcut after you've even patched, then they can still access the file system. And once they have access to the file system, yes, it's encoded, encrypted in some format, but then they can decrypt it, decode it, and they can get a little bit of understanding of what hard-coded credentials are in the appliance. And in some cases, not with this vulnerability in particular, but very similar vulnerabilities, we've seen them being able to get SSL, VPN user credentials through these types of files in the appliance.
So that's something really important I want to call out, because people are going to read these publications and go, oh, it only gives them read-only access. I'm like, they can't do anything. They can't change anything. But what you've just called it there, they can go hunting for hard-coded creds. They can go hunting for all of this sort of stuff that lets them pivot to that next layer. Is that the key takeaway around this sort of thing?
100%, yes. We've seen it quite often from a deep perspective. If there's hard-coded credentials, you need to consider yourself compromised if you need to do those threat hunts. If you have it patched, that's good, but what happens if it was exploited and the type of exploit leaves you vulnerable and then the threat actor can return? In this instance, we're talking about where a threat actor could download some files and they could return to your environment months later if you have an update to the username and password.
Let's be honest, if they're hard-coded in an appliance, how often are you really rotating them, right?
Yeah.
It's, scary. So what are the actions that Forti and I guess us that we're recommending to organizations in regard to these ones?
Yeah, so you kind of touched on Forti is pretty good with their security patches, and they've released them really quickly. And a number of their patches, the first one was obviously to resolve the vulnerability, but they actually released patches subsequently, which will automatically identify that symbolic link and remove it. So whilst we're talking about threat hunting, always a great idea, but Forti has gone a little bit further and said, we'll include a little bit of a search for those links to make sure that you are secure.
Excellent. That's a great idea. So, I mean, because one of the key takeaways here was they were still compromised even after patching and upgrading. So being able to go and break those symbolic links and make sure that these assets are no longer compromised, I applaud them for that. I think it's a really proactive thing to do. And I wish more vendors would do that sort of thing. All right, let's have a look at Ivanti, and this is a remote code execution vulnerability. So can you walk me through this one in what used to be the Pulse Secure product is now Ivanti Connect Secure?
Yeah, so this one, I believe, was actually initially released as a denial of service vulnerability, and it was since upgraded. And now they obviously determined, actually it leads to a little bit more than just remote code execution of a few characters. There's a little bit more to be concerned about. And that came off of research by Mandiant, I believe. And Mandiant's done some really good deep dive into this vulnerability. And realistically, if you've got this appliance, patch in, but have a read of these articles that are getting released. They are a really good place to threat hunt in the environment. The article by Mandiant has a lot of different files that are dropped if it is exploited. Have a look for those files. Really good place to start. And then obviously patch in the appliance. It's a bit concerning when CISA also says if you are concerned you're vulnerable, you should reset the appliance. That kind of sheds light on what it is. Yeah,
and look, to me, that leads to something else is, and the reason I didn't ask it on the Forti one is Forti, Ivanti, let's be any firewall, right, any switch. These products are not great at sending all pertinent logs to a SIEM solution if they're sending logs to a SIEM. So then you're relying on having to threat hunt with the available logs. I'd love to pick your brain, and again, a question without notice. When you are triaging these types of assets as part of your DFR activity, what sort of logs are you actually getting hold of? Like my experience is you might get 7 days worth of logs on one of these boxes.
Yep, it's like you've done one of the investigations. Yeah,
Years ago.
Very logging. And we have to rely on obscure log sources, right? So what's on the file system? Is there anything in those 7 days? Usually we come in after the scenario and after 7 days. So we can talk about a little bit around VPNs. So if initial access via VPN, we can look at the VPN range and go, oh, this is a pretty good indication that was via exploitation of the VPN. Looking at, was there lateral movement via the fireball IP address? Stuff like that. But like with this scenario, we're looking for those main indicators. So these files that are specifically a good indicator of that vulnerability in itself being exploited.
Excellent.
Like firewalls are really good at logging the structured traffic that they manage. So they'll log what they're aware of. The problem with these sorts of vulnerabilities is that they're not aware of them, and it's the firewall behaving in a way that's not anticipated by the person that's made it. And typically we've found that the most effective way to actually triage this is actually looking downstream for the firewall of, well, assuming this was compromised, how would this then play out internally? Or if files are dropped, reverse engineering those files, understanding how they worked, and then you need to parse log sources for evidence of that sort of communication. It's not as simple as just open up the console and then filter to, okay, for malicious activity, yep, okay, we've been compromised.
Exactly. And to me, and I guess that's the point I wanted to get to, right? Just because you've got these appliances out there and they might be feeding to a seam, you need to think about the holistic view of the environment with how common these compromises are. Again, it comes back to don't be the lowest hanging fruit. Make sure you are taking this guidance seriously and you're actioning it very, very quickly.
And threat velocity these days is through the roof. Like the speed from CVE announced to POC published to in the wild exploitation, sometimes that's not even the order anymore. So they're being able to timely patch these appliances is like crucial.
Yep. And that's why the possible loss of CVE terrifies me as a defender. Yep. I think that's a really sobering note to leave that on. All right, guys. Look, thank you very much. Again, this is Brad Morgan, Head of Managed Services at Triskel Labs. I thank Caleb Boyd, DFI Analyst, and Craig, Head of Incident Response at Triskel Labs. Thank you both very much for your time. If you've got any questions, feel free to send them through to Triskel Labs or reach out to any of us directly on LinkedIn. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks.
All. Cheers.